Hello, and welcome to the 58th episode of NEOHUMAN podcast. I'm Agah Bahari, etologist on Twitter and Instagram, and you can follow the show on liveinlimbo.com, iTunes, YouTube, and BitChute. And with me, I'm welcoming back for the third time on NEOHUMAN podcast, Zoltan Istvan. Welcome back to NEOHUMAN podcast, Zoltan.
Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Always a pleasure. For those of our audience who are not familiar with your work and who you are and what you've done, why don't we start with your background, the work you've done, and the lives you've lived, and what are you mainly focused on now these days?
Sure. Well, a lot of people know me as the transhumanist guy, the guy who wants to merge people with machines using science and technology. And just so your listeners know, transhumanism is a social movement of many millions of people around the world that want to use science and technology to upgrade the human being. However, my specialty in this field has really been running political campaigns where I emphasize science and technology. I ran in 2016 as a presidential candidate, as in 2018 as a libertarian gubernatorial candidate in California, and now I'm running again as a Republican in the 2020 presidential race.
What is so interesting about getting involved in United States politics now these days, considering all the division and all the very unscientific and sometimes anti-tech kind of a narrative that is going on within the partisan politics here in the United States here?
Well, it just feels like some people really like radical science and tech and some people don't. And, if you like it, then you're very interested in it. But if you're, against it for some reason, because maybe you're either super religious or maybe you're super just don't want to change, or you're really like an older person, a lot of older people just don't seem to really like transhumanism that much, then you might not be into it. But in terms of politics, like really nothing is changing our world, the American world, more than artificial intelligence, genetic editing, brain implants. I mean, these are things that are going to become the huge next drivers of the economy, as well as kind of where the future is going in the next 10 to 20 years. So I think politics must play a very big role of it. And that's sort of where my policy and my campaigns come in, as I try to make a statement for those things that other candidates won't talk about.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean, that nobody's really talking about the AI, genetic engineering, and all the important things, but they're all fighting with each other over basically partisan bullshit. So my bigger point is that what is the point of trying to get anything done in such a broken system from within when a lot can be done from outside of a system? Like we see that big tech companies have far more impact than, let's say, representatives in DC.
Well, so I've tried this before, just so when I ran for the Libertarians, which is, of course, the third party, unless you have structure built into the system, either through the Democrats or the Republicans, it's very hard as an independent to get any kind of real traction, because all 50 states have ballot requirements, and some of those ballot requirements are incredibly expensive, millions of dollars to get on. So if you really want to kind of play in the big leagues, you kind of have to choose one of the two parties. I don't like that. I wish we had a stronger third party in here in America and other independent candidates that can make a difference. But really, if you want to be in the game, you kind of have to follow those rules of one side or the other. And I chose the side just because I'm fiscally conservative, and that's why I'm running this time around. But a large part of what I'm trying to do is also tell Republicans, look, if you're not going to be interested in transhumanism, then the left is going to take it away from you and turn it to another dominated social movement of the left. Yep. And I keep telling one of the big premises I run on is, it's not that I'm super huge fan of the Republicans or a super huge fan of the Democrats. I'm a kind of a technology person, more of a centrist. But I definitely know that socialism isn't good for transhumanism. I definitely know that socialism isn't good for science and technology. So the Republicans have to stand up and try to pool transhumanism, in a way that they can have some ownership over, rather than it just fall completely in the hands of the left. And this is really what a lot of my presidential campaign is about, is trying to make sure artificial intelligence isn't socially driven, trying to make sure that genetic editing isn't driven entirely by the far left. The environmental movement's a very good example. It's an entirely left-leaning movement. Do we want transhumanism to become like that? No. So we need some more balance. And I'm trying to bring that balance to the public's knowledge.
And for people to know, there are already factions within the transhumanist movement who are leaning far left. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, transhumanism is overwhelmingly far left
Yeah.
at this moment. It just happens to be that some of the major players in the movement, thankfully, are either libertarian or fiscally conservative. And because it began as a sort of libertarian, fiscally conservative movement, but I can tell you, I mean, the great majority now have turned hard left, and they're youthful. And I'm really excited about the growth of the movement. Since we've talked, it's growing all the time, but it is growing to the left, and I'm not sure how far that can happen without without something bad happening. This technology doesn't come for free. It comes from hard work, innovation, free markets, entrepreneurial spirit. These are things not normally associated with the hard left. And so we need to make sure there's a better balance. And that's what I'm here to try to do with my campaign, is say, look, transhumanism needs some fiscally conservative, responsible people to come out and say it's also our movement.
And also, it seems to me that what far left is really hell bent on doing is to creating a bigger, more centrally driven state, federal government that take based on the priorities that they determine, and then they distribute based on the priorities that they determine. But the tech-based world and the digitization that we are experiencing will really only work, from my perspective, in a decentralized and secure by design kind of a system that is not relying on any kind of a centralized structure of authority in form of federal government.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that. I mean, I think being decentralized is one of the huge pluses of being fiscally conservative, because everybody's competing against one another.
Yeah.
And ultimately what happens is you have people that win and that win again, and then new companies come up and try to win. And that creates that decentralization that we're all sort of looking for. Of course, when you swallow it in like the socialist type situation, it's all under control of a central authority. And if that authority is wrong, then the entire movement is sabotaged. And again, this is why really it needs a better balance. It needs to have, I don't mind some left-leaning people trying to infiltrate it, run it, own it. Naturally, I kind of think a good balance is good. It goes back and forth. That's how America became really strong, I think. Unfortunately, though, it's right now it's turning so hard left that there's so few fiscally conservative people out there, or libertarian people, or conservatives like myself out there trying to move it, that I'm genuinely worried that transhumanism in Silicon Valley is going to fall to the hard left and never come up for air again.
Right. There are very few people within, at least the vocal ones, within Silicon Valley who are talking against the far left. I know Peter Thiel moved out of Silicon Valley to Los Angeles because of the very same thing. He has had enough of the culture of it. It's just very destructive. Whoever that you're talking to with a little bit of brain, they're sick and tired of it.
A lot of us are sick and tired of it. And I think some of the left, some of the more normal left, are sick and tired of it too. It's what's happened is that media, which is comprised a lot of very young journalists who are very left, because of course they don't have much money, and a lot of them don't have children, so they haven't really had to deal with life in a real kind of way. I'm a father of 2 kids. I can tell you that I was more left-leaning, and then I had kids, and then all of a sudden I said, wow, wait a sec, this is the 24/7 responsibility. And responsibility is sort of what makes people fiscally conservative. It's because you're like, wait a sec, this is real. I can't miss a day at work and not pay get my check and feed my kids. There are hard responsibilities, A equals A type of thing. And I think as media has painted this picture where it makes more sense for Apple and Google and some of these other tech companies to seemingly lean left in order to seem like they're really nice people. But deep down, I mean, Silicon Valley still has that driving hunger of capitalism. And I hope it'll kind of raise its head and not just be convinced because it must appease the media and especially the younger generation, which of course naturally leans left when they're younger. But, I just worried because there's tipping points. And once you tip too far to the left, it's very hard to get any kind of balance back or even come back at all.
Yeah, especially now that there is this ongoing competition between a closed system being China and some kind of a competitive system at its core being United States. And the Chinese, quite honestly, they have a lot of advantages over Americans because they don't care really about, and I'm talking in the perspective from the perspective of technological advancement, they're not bound by religion. They are not bound by, we shouldn't experiment with genetic engineering, for example, because we're going to upset God of some kind. And at the same time, they are very centrally focused on collecting as much data as they can to empower their artificial intelligence as strongly as they can, because they got it. They know what's going on. And yet we are here complaining about and arguing about, whether or not Russia hired prostitutes to pee on Trump, whether or not that's the case. It seems like the education of people is lacking deeply. And at the same time, this uncertain kind of a time that we're experiencing, people are trying to hang on to whatever that makes sense to them already, rather than learning new things that are coming, because this decade is going to be insane.
Oh, well, I mean, you nailed on kind of the number one topic that I'm really pushing in my campaign, which is, outside of, I guess, socialism and transhumanism, is this idea that China is just whooping our butt. And there's just, this is not something you can come back from, because it would be one thing if we had the same population, sort of like with, Russia, our populations were pretty same. No, China has 4 times the amount of people, and they have almost as many engineers as our entire workforce. We do not get a second chance with this game. Once China surpasses our economy, and it's pretty much a foregone conclusion they will at this point, it's sort of game over in terms of America being great and America leading the world forward in terms of culture, in terms of democracy, in terms of the things that mean a lot to us. And when you're talking with so many millions of engineers, and they have a culture of working hard, and they have a culture of just kind of like obedience, we may not appreciate that, but from an economic point of view, when they talk about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, of course, you nailed on the big one, they're secular. It's really our conservatism that often gets in the way of us developing innovation. We don't want to do any genetic editing. We don't want to augment our intelligence because we're too religious, and that would be changing the body of God or something like that. People don't really get it that, well, whether Americans do it or not, China's going to do it. And if they upgrade and augment an entire generation of Chinese babies with higher IQs than us through their new types of genetic engineering, we're dead in the water. So whether we like it or not, America has to step up to the plate. And that requires both the left and the right together to say, wait a sec, we have a common adversary, and we don't want that nation, China, to become that much stronger than us. And unfortunately, I don't know. I'm not saying it's game over, but we're in the 4th inning, and we're starting to throw Hail Mary passes, because we need to just take a huge chunk of money and a huge amount of incentives, put them into genetic engineering, put them into AI, put them into brain implants, put them into all the different radical technologies out there that can transform our economy and make it so that we can be leading the world forward. There's a reason that Apple and Google and Microsoft and Amazon are the largest companies in the world right now. It's all tech companies. But right now, China's leading us in AI. They're leading us in genetic editing. They have the first genetically edited babies alive right now. If we don't catch up, we're dead in the water.
Not only they're leading us, they're also setting the narrative in the United States, like we saw with NBA and Disney, using their market size. So like PC culture is a very problematic one, that you cannot question certain kind of concepts and subjects. And it seems like China has recognized that as a weakness of the West, and they keep poking at it.
Of course they are, because it is a weakness of the West.
Why wouldn't they? Exactly.
And, and also, just speaking of war, Trump, I think, had spoken to President Jimmy Carter, and he had said, look, China isn't spending any money on wars, and look at what we're doing. At some point, building too many bombs, unless we're going to actually use them, and I highly doubt we're going to use them against China, it just works against us. We need to innovate. We need to beat China where it counts. And that means AI. That means genetic editing. That means in the science and tech industries, which very quickly, when the stock market, you look at the stock market over the last 2 decades, it's stacking those tech companies up front. We need 4 or 5 or 6 more companies like Apple, 5 or 6 more companies like Google, that size. Because when you look at the Chinese population, I mean, they're creating, like I heard some kind of crazy statistic. We created like 3 or 4 million jobs in the last few years. That's great. I'm happy about it. Trump's done good in the economy. No question about that. But China created 65 million jobs in the same time frame. We can't compete against a nation that's 4 times our size. And beyond that comes India. India in the next decade will pass China's population, and they have the same situation going. A very good work ethic, where all of a sudden they're going to have 100 or 200 million engineers, and they're going to become number 2 or number 1, and America's going to be number 3. This all in 10 years' time, before my children even go to college. And I'm very worried about it. Part of why I'm running for president is to say, try to wake up people and say, listen, it doesn't win you votes to talk about artificial intelligence. It doesn't win you votes to talk about weird stuff like genetic editing, but it's the reality of winning the race of being the leading nation. If you want to lead the world forward, these topics must be addressed. Innovation must occur here. Otherwise, it's really a lost cause. These are going to be not only trillion-dollar companies regarding AI and genetic editing, but they're going to be multi-trillion-dollar companies.
Yeah, and this is not sci-fi. And China already has had their first successfully, can I say, designer babies early last year.
No, it's not America. It's China that had it. And that's, that's what's scary about it is, wait a sec, I thought we were leading the world in this stuff. No, we're not. We may be able to have some of that technology to do it, but our government won't allow us to do it. And this is really where I come in saying, look, I'm a new type of Republican. Somebody that wants to say, look, it's okay to be fiscally conservative. I am. It's okay to have some traditional values. That's fine. But we can't lose the economic race or the innovation race when it comes to other countries. It means we have to expand our minds. We have to open ourselves a little bit. The Republican Party can't always be so closed-minded. It's okay to embrace genetic editing, fit it within your religious framework, fit it within your traditional values. You can do so. But whatever happens, and I would say most importantly, don't let China lead it because we're never going to catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a new book out called Upgrading America, The Political Writings of Zoltan Istvan. We've been talking about what we're talking about now since the first time I had you on the show, which was June of 2016. And then I came down to Philadelphia to campaign with you outside of DNC. And you've been consistent. That's the thing. And you've been very active in the media. So would you say that this book, Upgrading America, is a conclusion of all of your activity and experiences for this political campaign, and basically the kind of roadmap that you're laying down that this is how America should be governed, whether or not you will be the president or not?
Well, I would definitely say it's, it comprises all my writings together. There are 3 or 4 essays in there that are not policy in 2020 because they're so controversial. However, I don't want to see myself as somebody who only adheres to policies and for the next 20 years, that's what I'm going to believe in. I'd like to see myself as somebody who can grow, somebody who might be able to say, you know what, I made a mistake. I'm able to reach outside of myself, or I'm able to hear a new theory. And the book comprises everything the best that I could put forth. It doesn't mean that I'm correct in all of it, but I do believe that 80% of it is plenty enough to lead the nation forward into the future. And in order to beat China and India as we come across the kind of the new decade and things like that, it's just tough because some of my writing, I write as a philosopher and almost as an artist. I provoke people to say, what can we think? How far can we take this? And then there's some that are just clear standard policies, like we need to do better. We need to fix inequality. We need to fix education. We need to fix the prison system. There are some things that are just like so blatantly obvious, they'll remain policy forever. But some of it's a little bit more controversial. And, I hope when people look at the book, they'll try to see the difference between the philosopher and the person who's running for office saying, this is what really is my policy. My website, Zoltan2020.com, has the actual 20-point plan, but literally it's 95% of those essays in there. And just so your audience knows, it's essays from the New York Times, it's essays from Vice, essays from HuffPost, essays from Newsweek, essays from some different types of publications that are more academic or scholarly. It's a good 6 years of the best opinion essays that I could write on the topics of politics and on where I think the country is going and where it should be going.
How has the response by Republicans and conservatives have been with respect to what you're talking about? Mix.
It's not as good as I wanted it to be. Donations haven't been as strong as I would have hoped. I originally saw myself as sort of a Trojan horse in the Republican Party, thinking, okay, I'm going to come in and all of a sudden it's going to explode and we're going to see a brand new Republican Party. All the younger Republicans are going to go for me and say, this is the future. But Trump is such a dominating personality, and he's frankly doing pretty good with the economy. And for a lot of people, that's all that really matters, that it's very hard to compete against him. And the media doesn't really want to give attention because, honestly, the media works off ads. And frankly, who could be better for ads than Trump? He creates controversy all the time. And so I don't think the Republican Party has heard my message. I honestly don't think 2020 is the year for transhumanism. I'm not even sure after my reception if 2024 will be the year, but I think it's coming. And I hope that the Republicans, in deep in their minds, say, wait a sec, it's important to remember that transhumanism is on the radar now. And we need to keep it in mind for the future, because if it is the future, we want to own that future rather than, like I said, from the original things we're talking about, we have the far left owning that. And so I hope I've made a difference. And again, that's all I tried to do. I didn't come into this race thinking that I was going to beat Trump. That was never, I'm realistic enough. Will my time come in 2028 or 2032? That now is a different conversation. Maybe if I keep at this, eventually the publicity and the media coverage will grow big enough where I can make a real campaign that actually can dent the system. But in the meantime, what I'm really trying to do is get the Republican Party to say, wait a sec, China's embracing transhumanism. If America doesn't embrace it, we're going to be, in a very sorry state. So how can we get fiscally conservative people more on board with some of these radical technologies, even if they seem a little bit controversial?
Well, one thing about when you're saying in 2024, 2028, or even further than that, there will be a opportunity for a transhumanist president. The question is whether or not there will be any need for a human president at that point. Now that we're starting the decade of really mainstream big data, Internet of Things, machine learning, and artificial intelligence, why not having an AI president? One of the things that I always think about Trump is that Trump has the opportunity to be the last human and the first AI president of the United States, considering the size and depth of the databases that has been created about him, both public and private.
Well, it is possible if he wins a second term that he could be the last one. It would require a stretch of our imagination, because I don't think general artificial intelligence will be here by then. But it's very possible that an AI strong enough to govern by what we might call governing by the greatest good for the greatest amount of people could already start happening by 2024. Whether humanity and Americans will be ready for that is a whole other idea. But, I originally in 2016 had reached out to IBM to try to debate Watson. Watson was for a while thinking about running for president, and I thought that was a very interesting thing. And I think there's no question by the end of this decade we're going to have some serious contenders for in a political way that are AI based, and they may have human companions at first, kind of an AI with a human running together, and that might be the very best way to govern. But there's no question, probably by 2030s, it'll be just best to leave it up to a machine, because in the end of the day, we can monitor, all the databases can tell people what's best for them, what's best for the economy. How do we squeeze every single dollar out of the economy? And if we can have a machine tell us how to do that without all the fighting and the divisiveness and everything else that's happening, it might make sense to do it. Again, that's a very challenging perspective, because at the same time that AI comes is the time, the different companies like Elon Musk and other people working on Neuralink, and Brian Johnson with Kernel, his company, will we be able to connect to that AI with our brain and machine interface? And then all of a sudden, is it us or is it the AI, or are we just one and the same? And I think that's where the world is going eventually, so the economy can kind of keep up and we can kind of stave off innovation and things like that. But, it's good. No matter what happens, the next 10 years are going to be so crazy, so wild, and so brilliant, that it's going to just, I think every morning we're going to turn on the news and be like, oh, I can't believe this happened. This is so bizarre. But again, from a political perspective, if America doesn't own it, someone else does. And if a Chinese company or a Chinese government owns it, and that's the AI that they're sending to us to run our country, we're in for it, which is exactly why I want to just tell your listeners, listen, we need to win this. America needs to continue to own innovation across the world, because it's such a critical moment in time to not lose our leadership, to make sure that democracy actually survives. China is not a democracy. The voting system is completely different than how we have it here. So we need to make sure we win this game. Otherwise, it's going to be a very, very different world.
No, it just seems like the two biggest thing is, first of all, get rid of central structures of authorities to have control over our data, whether they're corporations or military or any kind of a state. And then the second is to educate the society, because any technology works as well as the society that adapts it. I keep bringing this up. The Japanese are doing a far better job than Americans adopting into new technologies.
Well, yeah, I think the Japanese have that kind of Buddhist perspective. People think, oh, it has nothing to do with religion, but honestly, I think a lot of it does. If your religious outlook is oftentimes your cultural outlook.
Yeah.
And Japan, if you've been there, it's very Buddhist, and Buddhist means sort of anything goes as long as you try to be nice. And it can be gods, or it can be no God, or it can be the void. But the point of the story is all technology is neutral. Therefore, you can accept it if it's acceptable to your society. Whereas in America, nobody says technology is neutral. People say, oh, technology is terrible. Or they'll say, technology is very great. And I think America has to get over that kind of, yin yang stuff and say, wait a sec, technology is just something that's just whatever we make of it. And we should embrace the most advanced technology we can have as long as we find it being functional for our lives. And we shouldn't put it in the context of religion or the context of culture or the context of other things. It's really just a context of, is it functional or not? If Americans would do that, then all of a sudden I think Congress would pass tons of bills. We'd start spending a huge amount of money on all these crazy innovations, and we'd outdo the Chinese. But as it is, as long as we're conservative, it seems like Trump and Mike Pence and other people are sort of, shy of technology or wanting to stay away from it without realizing that, without innovating in that area, we're going to lose to, India and China at some point in the future. That day is coming. We can't allow that.
I agree. Zoltan's book is called Upgrading America, The Political Writings of Zoltan Istvan. Always a pleasure talking to you. I know the time is limited, so let me ask you the last question I ask all my guests, that if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say is the worst thing humanity has done, and what would you say is our greatest achievement?
Well, the worst thing, that's such an interesting question. Let me give it a sec. Look, in my opinion, the worst thing that we've done is convince ourselves of a politically correct nature that's an okay statement. What I'm worried about most when I see Americans is that people are saying, we must be soft. We must be snowflakes. We must be like not hurt, not stomp on anyone's feelings. And honestly, this is killing innovation. The most courageous part of us is to break out. And sometimes when we break out, it's terrible. And sometimes when we break out, it's ugly. And sometimes when we break out, it's totally non-functional. But sometimes we break out. That's how the universe and the whole species moves forward. But we have such a tightening politically correct culture in America that it seems like you can't say anything, you can't innovate anything, you can't even do anything. And this is why Silicon Valley is turning left. The media has made it so that they don't want you to say anything that's against the grain. And I'm a guy who just goes out there to provoke people to say, what can we think? I'm not right all the time, but it's okay that we think of out of the box. So the worst thing that's happening to me right now, at least to the Western part of human beings, is that we're becoming politically correct. The best thing is that people are fighting against that. People want to break out still, and people still want to say, look, I want to cut off my arm, put on a robotic arm because I want to throw a football 2 miles long, or I want to, do whatever I want with my crazy new cyborg body. And even though that's totally against the grain, we're going to look back in 100 years and say, thankfully, people stood up and said, I'm not going to listen to what's politically correct, what's right, what fits within moral boundaries, what fits within religious, context. I went my own direction. I walked to a different drum beat, and I found something that I really love. And as long as we have people doing that, then that's the greatest thing that people can do.